What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader 1 year later. As believe it or not, it has been a year since this game released, though technically I am a couple of days early. The official day is December 7th, but it's going to be a busy weekend, so I decided to go ahead and get this done now. And in that year, we've seen a bit of a buggy launch, to be sure, with some broken companion quest lines, some problems with convictions, to the bulk of that being fixed pretty quickly, sweeping overhauls to certain game systems, like exactly how individual combat scenarios played out in terms of things like additional turns, power scaling, etc., all the way to the game's first DLC, Void Shadows. And to sum it up here towards the beginning of the video, I would say that Rogue Trader has had a very good first year. In fact, Void Shadows was a great bit of DLC. And while I was a little apprehensive about the changes they made to balancing with patch 1.2, even those I would say ultimately worked out for the best. And with an upcoming patch 1.3, already having been announced, along with some of the things they plan to include with that particular patch, and the fact that we still have at least one more DLC to go, there's plenty to look forward to. But let's break this down a little bit step by step and talk about what the year has been like for this game. So right away, I would say, as I mentioned, bit of a buggy launch. It was not actually nearly as bad as some of their previous work, that is to say Owlcat Games. Kingmaker was borderline unplayable, past a certain point anyway, and Wrath of the Righteous had much more substantial problems. Now, that's not to make light of Rogue Trader's issues at launch, though, because they were nonetheless still pretty substantial. However, it really depended on what conviction you were playing. Convictions being this game's sort of morality system, so to speak, with your options being dogmatic, iconoclast, or heretical. Dogmatic actually worked great right out of the gate, though for somewhat humorous reasons. Now, I would say this is probably like the most canonical way you could play through the game if there was such a thing, so it's probably no surprise that this is the one that worked out the best overall. But you would actually bypass some of the game's initial launch problems if you went this route, because if you fully commit to it, it sees you killing certain companions, and that actually led to you killing the companions with the buggiest quests towards the end of the game, so where you wouldn't be able to finish their quests even if they were there. On that playthrough, they would probably be dead and you just wouldn't see them anyway. And then you had Iconoclast and Heretical, which could run into some more substantial problems, and all of that led to, I would say, somewhat mixed opinions on the game's launch. It was overall, I would say, pretty positive, mind you, but there was definitely some frustration with those bugs, which brings us to patch 1.1. Now, there were a whole host of smaller patches before and in between this, but we're going to focus on the largest patches, because patch 1.1 made about 1,800 different changes to the game in February of this year, so about 3 months or so after the game launched, and this patch, along with the several smaller patches previous, fixed the bulk of the problems. So when people ask me how this game is now and if everything is a-okay with it, that's pretty much my answer. If that kind of thing was your concern, that got sorted out quite some time ago. They were actually pretty well on top of that. Now, that's not to say you won't run into any bugs at all, as there will never be a truly bug-free game, but all the way back in February, the game was in a much, much better place. But that's not the only thing that patch did. It did also change a few other things, like changing and updating visual effects here and there and that type of stuff. But by far the largest changes to the game ultimately came from patch 1.2. This patch consisted of about 2,500 changes and was truly massive, and for good reason. They were overhauling several systems with this one. In particular, they wanted to address some game balance issues, fixing some things that were underperforming and tuning some things that got extremely overpowered in the endgame. And they did most of this by changing a lot of how the math was calculated on the back end. So instead of using multiplicative math, they changed a lot of it to addition to keep the power scaling towards the end game relatively in check. If you played all the way back then, you could get crazy overpowered towards the end and have one character just kill the entire enemy team in a single turn if you set it up properly, especially with the addition of the additional turn abilities and powers from characters like the Officer. So they aimed to rein a lot of that in with patch 1.2. And while people were initially a little upset about, some of those changes being less overpowered, I myself was pretty impacted by them as it affected most of the things I was doing. But after having played through the entire game with those changes, I do think it ultimately was for the best. But that isn't to say it was all nerfs, however, because some things got improved by a lot. In particular, Sanction Psychers, like the one your character can start the game as, got a huge power upgrade in the form of rebalancing mini abilities, as well as when you get your Psi rating, which is what opens up those abilities to begin with, alongside the overall power scaling of your general Psyker powers. Now, no one benefited more from this than the Pyromancer. Pyromancer was intended to be like the damage-oriented Psyker powers, however, that wasn't really the case on launch. They were a bit underwhelming. Now, they had useful effects in some cases, like one of them gave you like a stacking crit chance, which was useful for other builds as an example, but you would hardly ever use the powers for their intended purpose, which was damage. That got a buff in patch 1.2 and basically buffs across the board. Almost everything the Pyromancer did got better, and it's a really fun way to play the game now. But patch 1.2 is basically about rebalancing things more than anything else, which I would say was sorely needed ahead of Void Shadows, the game's first DLC, which released back in September. And this brought us a new companion in the form of Cabela, herself a member of an Imperial death cult that is home among your ship that you can get involved in while ultimately fighting off gene stealers who have invaded you as well. And Void Shadows is truly a tremendous bit of DLC. It takes place alongside the main game, adding more content as you go. Most of it is really well done. And you get all that interactivity with your new companion, of course. But if that wasn't enough for you, this also brought 2 new archetypes or classes to the game, the Executioner and the Blade Dancer. Both of which, well, honestly, probably a little overpowered, are extremely fun to play and mess around with. The Blade Dancer is all about movement, and they really did a good job of making you feel that. And the Executioner, which is all about focusing in on damage over time abilities, feels fantastic as well, especially in combination with the Blade Dancer, but even other archetypes as well, like the Warrior. And then if you want to add a Sanctioned Psyker on top of that, it can be really ridiculous, especially in a way that rewards a lot of tactical thinking. Now, in a patch alongside that DLC, we also got things like the Grim Darkness mode, or the game's proper Iron Man mode, which they waited to add until a lot of the initial problems with bugs were sorted out, which was probably the right move. Nobody wants to lose an Iron Man save to bugs you can't avoid. And that brings us to our current point in time. And overall, I would say Rogue Trader is in a much better place than it was at launch. In fact, they really turned it around with Void Shadows. I mean, it was already pretty good to begin with, but Void Shadows really is the icing on top of the cake at this point. But believe it or not, we're not done, because if we look towards the future a little bit, we can talk a bit about what has been announced for patch 1.3 already, on top of the upcoming DLC Lex Imperialis. Now for patch 1.3, which I believe is supposed to drop sometime before the end of the year, they plan on rebalancing some of the convictions, that is to say the points you have to earn in order to advance them. They've already done that once with some of the early patches, as it was extremely tight when the game launched. Basically, you'd have to do absolutely everything possible with a conviction to actually get to the final rank, at least for Dogmatic. When I did it, I remember only made it by like 2 or 3 points. It was nonsense. So they changed that early on, or, gave you a little more leeway. It looks like patch 1.3 will be reworking some of that as well, alongside making some improvements and changes to the cutscenes that are currently in the game, and adding furthermore voiceover for Cabela and her interactivity with other companions, which seems to be something that Owlcat as a studio has been leaning into more and more these days, as I think they really want to get voice acting added as much as possible to basically everything they do, as it tends to be such a sticking point for a lot of people, and it would appear that they've grown enough to where that's become a much more feasible thing to do. So with any luck, patch 1.3 will be a good one as well. Now, let's talk a little bit about that upcoming DLC, Lex Imperialis. What we know about this one is that we can expect another companion to be added to the game, as if there weren't enough already, but in particular, this one will be a member of the Adeptus Arbites, and the story is going to revolve around the collection of the Imperial Tithe, which is the tithe that individual planets pay to the overall Imperium of Man, because while the planets themselves are largely free to govern as they see fit, the Imperial Tithe has to be paid, and so as a person who governs a whole host of planets with literal colonies on them that you have to manage as part of the in-game elements that you interact with pretty regularly, should be pretty interesting. Now, beyond that, we really don't know. They really only planned the 2 DLCs, so we don't know if this will get quite as many as Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous did, or if they'll kind of move on to the many other projects we know they have in the works, which I would say is probably more likely given everything they've got on their plate at the moment. But that is ultimately speculation, and we will simply have to see. But as of right now, 1 year later, I genuinely think Rogue Trader is better than ever. and I'm excited to see where they take it from here, as I honestly think Void Shadow specifically will be a difficult act to follow in terms of DLC, so let's see if they manage to pull that off. But for now, I think that's pretty much going to wrap up this video. Do let me know what you thought about it down in the comments section below, and in particular, how you feel about Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader these days, especially if you've played it recently, as I'd love to know what you think. And naturally, that means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom, and have an amazing day.